dos, uno.
Buenos días a todos, todas y todes.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the International Day of Afro-Descendant Persons, organized by the Pan American Health Organization, the OAS, and the Inter-American Network of High Authorities for Policies on Afro-Descendant Populations. Riafro. Today is the International Day of Afro-Descendant people, and this is a world and regional consensus of the need to promote human rights, fundamental liberties of Afro-descendants in the context of the International Decade of Afro-Descendant People and the American Decade adopted by the OAS for Afro-descendant people or persons and co-launched by PAHO a few years ago. Today we will have a group of distinguished panelists who will be talking about the rights of Afro-descendant persons. Now, I invite Jesse Schutt-Eine, who will be giving the opening remarks.
It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today in honor of the International Day for People of African Descent. On behalf of PAHO, I'd like to welcome you. I'd first like to thank our fellow panelists and our distinguished leaders who have come together today to help us celebrate, and representatives of international organizations. And also I'd like to thank the Organization of American States and RIMSA, our partners in organizing this event today. It's last year in 2021 that the United Nations officially began to celebrate this day to recognize the contributions of people of African descent worldwide, the goal being to eradicate racism. The observance of this day reflects the global and regional consensus on the need to promote and protect all the human rights and fundamental freedoms of people of African descent. This was the basis for the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, a comprehensive human rights framework for the well-being and development of Afro-descendants and combating racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. In December 2013, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2015 to 2024 as the International Decade for People of African Descent, which represents a major commitment in the fight against racism. The decade's an opportunity to build greater understanding, appreciation, and respect towards people of African descent and their contributions, and to guarantee the equal enjoyment of human rights by all people. The Latin America and Caribbean region is characterized by its multi-ethnic and multicultural heritage, with indigenous people and Afro-descendants comprising a significant portion of the population in the region. People of African descent make up close to 30% of the total population in Latin America. Brazil has the largest number of Afro-descendants, about more than half of its total population. In terms of proportion, Haiti is the country with the highest percentage of Afro-descendants at 95.5%, representing over 11 million people. The second largest proportion of Afro-descendants is in Cuba, with more than 36%, followed by Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Panama, and the Dominican Republic. Despite these numbers, they're often invisible, with their contributions unnoted and their health concerns going unaddressed. The Pan American Health Organization recognizes that there are racial and ethnic inequalities in the region of the Americas, and that this poses obstacles to health and well-being and keep people of African descent from achieving their fundamental right to health. Much of this stems from slavery and its legacy of racism and social exclusion, a common context for Afro-descendants across the region of the Americas. As a consequence, inequalities based on ethnic origin, skin color, and other attributes keep people in a position of disadvantage and vulnerability. This includes higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and poor living conditions and health outcomes compared to those of European descent or even those who are of mixed ethnicity. Despite the growing visibility, people of African descent are still underrepresented in decision-making positions, both in the private sector and the public sector. They have fewer opportunities for social mobility as they're about 2.5 times more likely to live in conditions of chronic poverty. Even in the Caribbean region, where people of African descent form the vast majority of the population and are visible in political leadership, it's people of European descent who tend to hold the economic power. In response to the situation, PAHO proposed the first policy on ethnicity and health in 2017 and its strategy and plan of action in 2019. The strategy and plan of action gives us a unique opportunity to collect information and evidence to be able to see how countries are advancing to address some of the challenges faced by Afro-descendants as well as other ethnic groups. And we will hear about this during the panel discussions today. According to the PAHO report, The Health of Afro-Descendant People in Latin America, systematic racism in the health system contributes to several negative outcomes, including lower access to health insurance, poorer medical treatment, and worse health outcomes. These differences are often exacerbated by gender inequalities, with Afro-descendant women more likely than all others to lack health coverage in several countries. For example, in Brazil, Afro-descendant women's level of dissatisfaction on the quality of health services is 5.3% higher than that of women of non-Afro descent. In Ecuador, maternal mortality is nearly 4 times higher in Afro-descendant women compared to non-Afro-descendant women. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the inequities for Afro-descendants, particularly women. PAHO has worked to support the countries of the region to respond and mitigate the effects of this pandemic and stop its expansion. Our work in the Equity, Gender, and Cultural Diversity Office aims to ensure specific and differentiated strategies for the various ethnic groups, including Afro-descendants. PAHO and the OAS collaborated to drive action towards the health-related objectives of the Plan of Action for the International Decade for People of African Descent. In 2017, we had several ministries of health from across the region, including Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Venezuela. And with the support of PAHO and the Andean Organization for Health, we agreed on the Andean Health Plan for Afro-descendants from 2017 to 2021, which aimed to guarantee non-discrimination in health services and promote the right to health. Thanks to support from the Government of Canada, we're improving access to Afro-descendant communities, especially women from low-income and remote communities, to access COVID-19 vaccines. These are all important examples of how we need to work together at the community level and ensure specific interventions in order to make sustainable change. I'm glad that we're here this morning or this afternoon celebrating together, and we look forward to what I know will be a rich panel discussion, which can inform us and further our thinking on how to strengthen collaboration and action to address racism and racial discrimination. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Jessie. Y también
Thank you, Jesse. Congratulations for all the work that PAHO has been doing. I will introduce my colleague, whom I have known for years, and we have worked for the rights of Afro-descendant and indigenous peoples. I'm talking about Sandra. Thank you, Roberto. It is a pleasure to be with you. Sandra Del Pino speaking. Thank you to all the panelists who are with us today. These are people with whom we have been working for many years. It is a pleasure to celebrate today the International Day of Afro-Descendants. We are going to be able to hear a lot of reflections from experts in the field, and they are going to shed light on priorities, on our objectives to move ahead with the health agenda, which requires a great deal of effort and to which we are strongly committed. We have people who have been working on this topic for years, and it is a pleasure for me to moderate this discussion. First, I would like to introduce Janaina Costa. She's a research investigator of the University of Pelotas, uh, a PAHO WHO collaborating center at the International Center for Health Equity. The paper has been published in the regional Lancet for the Americas. Please talk to us about some of the results that you have gathered and how they can impact and how these analyses can um, be taken into practice. So, Janina, welcome.
I'm very happy to be here speaking with you today in this very important celebration. So let me start by saying a few words about this work that was released a week ago. So in collaboration with colleagues from the Pan American Health Organization, UNICEF, and WHO, we investigated gaps in coverage of 17 key indicators of maternal and child health in 10 Latin American and Caribbean countries using data from national surveys. Our analysis provides a landscape view of the status and magnitude of ethnic inequalities by describing multiple dimensions of health, well-being, and living conditions. And we found that in most countries, Afro-descendants performed worse than non-Afro-descendants in at least one of the indicators studied. And more systematic disadvantages for Afro-descendants were found for reproductive health, early marriage, and household hand washing and sanitation facilities. And in contrast, Afro-descendant women tended to present lower C-section rates, and Afro-descendant children presented lower undernutrition prevalence. So the inequalities are there, but they are not the same everywhere. And it's crucial for us, researchers, policymakers, and advocates to identify certain patterns that threaten Afro-descendants' well-being, but also to address the differences between countries. And another interesting finding in our analysis was the wealth-related gaps within Afro-descendant groups that were wider than those observed for non-Afro-descendants in many cases. And this suggests that the observed gaps and inequalities may be mediated by differences in socioeconomic position, and evidence shows that Afro-descendants are usually in lower socioeconomic positions. Now we come to the next point, which is the implication. And the results from this work have direct policy implications regarding the need to address existing gaps and engage in tackling discrimination and racism by targeting interventions in the health and related sectors. And I believe that to improve public policies in the region, there must be a deeper understanding of the conditions that explain the different performances. And once we understand where the inequalities are and how big they are, we are able to act upon them in order to advance in reducing inequalities and promoting health equity by incorporating knowledge and ancestral practices of Afro-descendant people, accounting for their culture and customs, and creating equal opportunities for all. And from the research perspective, this is an innovative approach since we do not work with ethnic inequalities as if it represented the same for all groups of Afro-descendants, indigenous, Roma population, and other groups. Instead, we choose to focus on Afro-descendants in order to better discuss and interpret the results we've got. And this way, it is a contribution to overcoming the statistical invisibility of Afro-descendants that reflect structural racism, and it's a major obstacle to achieving health equity.
Muchísimas gracias, Yanaina, por esas reflexiones que me parecen sumamente importantes.
Thank you, Janina, for your reflections. Very important, especially taking into consideration that we have different partners here with whom we have been working. From the standpoint of PAHO, we promote ethnicity, and it is very clear in our region. We have specific policies approved for this topic, even though representatives from different groups have sat together at a table. We need to be very specific when we are approaching health matters for Afro-Descendant persons. I would like to introduce Oscar Mojica, who is an epidemiologist, social epidemiologist expert. We know that there was a final report from the Commission of PAHO on equity and inequalities in health in the Americas, which was a commission chaired by Sir Michael Marmor, and we have also Mr. Murillo, who was part of that commission. Oscar, in that report, have they considered ethnic inequity as a social determinant of health, and what specific recommendations are presented through this report in order to approach the inequalities in the Afro-descendant populations? Over to you. Yes, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here in this webinar today. In this so very special day, we are celebrating, and I thank for the opportunity to be here with you. A special greeting to Pastor Murillo, the commissioner, who was part of that select group of commissioners working hard for over 2 years in preparing a report which, sincerely and in my opinion, is not only transcendental to advance the topic of justice and equity in the Americas, but it is in many ways revolutionary as well. This report is called Just Societies. That is the title, Just Societies. And this says a lot because it appeals to the issue of social justice and not only equity in health. Of course, the subtitle is Equity in Health and Decent Life. And the conclusions are around a conceptual framework in which it is considered that health and well-being are not only an end in and of themselves, but also basic elements in health inequity and human dignity. This conceptual framework corresponds to that of social determinants and social determinants of health in particular, which is the same conceptual framework of the Marmol Commission back in 2008, the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, which recognizes the determinant role, and hence the name determinant. It is not that it conditions, it determines health, hence the adjective determinant. And so the different circumstances in life and distribution of wealth and power, and yes, ethnicity within this conceptual framework in the Americas, in addition, as opposed to the WHO conceptual framework 15 years before, places ethnicity in an explicit and prominent place. In fact, in addition to biological factors related to healthcare, the Commission says that a sine qua non is to achieving health is combining structural factors, conditions of daily living, and governance to achieve equity in health. Consequently, recommendations by the Commission were also structured around those components. Although recommendations vary with respect to requirements set by the health sector and other sectors, as well as non-state agents and state agents, there are also important common denominators. First of all, attention is centered on things that affect daily living, emphasizing the different repercussions along the course of life. They also underline the need to carry out intersectoral actions to approach social and environmental determinants of health and providing services to meet the needs of the population. There is also the proportional universalism concept, an approach where we center on population groups that are at risk of being excluded with a view to universal health. And the recommendations considered that participation and engagement of populations and the public in general in all measures related to equity. And more specifically, and I am coming to the end of my remarks, the Commission ends with three big recommendations. First of them, this is the order in which they were published. Achieve equity in social, political, cultural, and economic factors, emphasizing three specific recommendations. Progressive fiscal policies, reinforcement of the role of the state in providing services, and approaching corruption and the threat that corruption means for justice and social equity. That's the first recommendation. Second recommendation is to protect the natural environment, respecting relationship with the earth. This recommendation, the second one, includes adapting to climate change, mitigation of the effects of climate change, reducing environmental damage caused by extractive industries, and formulating policies that foment indigenous peoples' relationship with the land. The third recommendation goes to the heart of what we're talking about. This third recommendation says that we need to recognize and reverse the impact of persistent colonialism and structural racism in equity in health. And I think this is why this is a great recommendation. It is revolutionary indeed, because this had never been made explicit in any mandate or document published by the organization. This is very clear, reversing the effects of structural racism. And there are three specific recommendations: to take measures to combat philosophy, culture, policies, and practices that emerge from historic colonialism and current colonialism, and ensure that Afro-Descendant peoples and indigenous people will have the freedom to have decent lives, worthy lives, and adopt positive measures to combat structural racism. Over to you. Thank you very much, Oscar, for these remarks based on this report, which is so innovative and puts us all vis-a-vis very concrete recommendations. I think we will need to delve deeper into the things that you have shared with us, the different expertises that allow us to see all the contributions that we have. We have different mandates, and we need to work together. We need to also remember that we have Pastor with us today, who was part of the commission. And now, dealing with the issue of data, I would like to introduce Adrian Gotts, who's with us. Adrian, in the framework of the work being carried out by PAHO, we would like to know how the countries in the region have advanced in matters of inclusion of ethnicity or ethnic belonging, with specific emphasis on when you identify as an Afro-descendant, and what are the greatest challenges that countries face to continue to make inroads in this work. Over to you.
I want to say good day to everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me and the team to be a part of this very important day. To address your question, Sandra, I like to say that strengthening information systems is a key area within PAHO's technical cooperation with countries, not only at the regional level, but at national and subnational, and even down to local levels, such as municipalities. In order to really see where we are on universal health, it's fundamental that we improve health information systems, because it is necessary to track progress in global, regional, and national level goals, that we are asking for improvement. We are calling upon member states to have improvement in these areas. In order to do that, you have to go down beyond national level to do these things. In terms of looking at equity across the board with ethnic groups, particularly Afro-Descendant, as we are speaking of today, this requires data disaggregation. And we are finding that within this area, within our region, we do have disaggregated data, but at varying degrees. Our health information systems are matured at various degrees. So you have information on ethnic group or race in some countries as is defined in censuses, in other national surveys, and even in some instances, ethnic groups, ethnic information disaggregated to the level of administrative data. However, with that said, we find that there is still an invisibility among Afro-Descendant people in vital registration and civil registration because of these gaps in maturity. It's complex, the identification of Afro-Descendants, because there's still a lack of agreement on who are Afro-Descendant people. This varies within a given country. It also makes it difficult to have an estimate of the population of African descendants down at the national level and to compare that across the whole region. So the challenge is to really call for broader disaggregation of data, but at all levels, especially within administrative data. And this call to action really is highlighted in the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, looking at the SDG target 17.18, which calls for enhancing capacity building to support developing countries, including for the availability of high quality data, timely data, reliable data that's disaggregated not only by ethnicity, but also by income, gender, age, race, migratory status, disability, geographic location, educational attainment, and various other social determinants of health within a national context. So it's very important that although we have these standards across really global from WHO and also regional from PAHO, how do you really define those standards within a given country? How do you put it into the country context and make it usable? So in increasing that capacity to improve information systems and health, equally goes with increasing the capacity to analyze and use this data and monitor it. So when we talk about using, monitoring, analyzing, we're not just talking about one point in time. We're talking about this should be a part of a continuous process within national health strategic plans, so that that feedback from that monitoring and that analysis is not just one directional. It's not just used at the national level, but it should be used as a cyclical type of approach to improve health for particular populations, such as Afro-Descendants. So really, this is a challenge that is before us at a region and there for all of our countries. We've learned a lot from the recent COVID-19 and what can happen when we have groups that have been systematically disadvantaged over time. And COVID-19, when we look at information from the United States as they've collected and reported information by race, one of the things we see is that Afro-Descendant people in the United States, life expectancy has decreased by 4 years. this is a pandemic that in which we are into year 3, but we already know it has had a heavy impact on life expectancy for this population. We should also be looking into data in other countries in our region for this type of information to see what are those challenges, what are those disadvantages, what has the impact of such a great pandemic been on health, on life in general for Afro-Descendants as we have. So it is really important to have strong health information systems disaggregated by ethnicity so that we can really pinpoint where the issues are. If we pinpoint where the issues are, then we can begin to further address these issues and close gaps in health and equity and life and well-being for Afro-Descendants, as well as other groups. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Y como vemos, pues hay muchísimos avances.
As we see, there is a lot of progress, but it is important to remember that for PAHO, as Adrienne mentioned, one of the priority areas is to strengthen the information systems for health. And it is also very important to know that we are committed to do so. I would like to make a comment about what we have heard. Roberto, I would like to give you the floor because we at PAHO are convinced that it is very necessary to work on this issue hand in hand with our Afro-Descendant population. And of course, cooperating with the entities and organizations with which we have been cooperating for a long time. Roberto, please. Thank you so much, Sandra. Precisely with regards to this cooperation, not only with the population, but also with the authorities that are in charge of the monitoring of public policies for Afro-Descendants, I would like to invite Susana Matute Sharon, who is the Vice President of Riafro, and she is also the Director for Policies for the Afro-Descendant population in Peru. Susana, welcome. We have cooperated with Susana and we have been friends for many years. We admire her work and her activism. Susana, welcome. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you so much for your kind presentation. I would like to join you and salute you on today's celebration of all Afro-Descendants at the international level. This permanent effort to make more visible the contribution of Afro-Descendants in the Americas and in the world. And I am happy that we are meeting today to share our views on health, which is a very important issue. We have been working with our allies. We have been coordinating in the Inter-American Network for Afro-Descendant related policies. And also we have been working with organizations that have helped us come to decisions at the general level and at the specific level within our countries. I believe that COVID-19 has been a trigger which has highlighted that the gaps were deeper and deeper, that we had a very low percentage level with regard to the mean of the population throughout the continent. And I would like to add that despite the fact that COVID and the pandemic has been very hard, the network has not stopped functioning. And Susana, that is precisely what you would like you to talk about. How do you think that PAHO can cooperate with the Riafro network to improve health of Afro-Descendants in the Americas? Well, some of the things that have been done and on which we need to continue working are precisely related to this effort to give greater visibility to how Afro-descendants have been attacked and have been vulnerable within the context of COVID. For instance, there are some places where gaps are enormous, and there is an underrepresentation of Afro-descendants in health. But when you look at the official data, so first of all, you have a very high number of vulnerable people, but when you look at the records, you see that the representation is very low because they are not using the application of the variable of ethnic identification. And this has become very clear throughout the pandemic as far as diagnostic, early detection alerts, and also in the case of vaccination and also the care for collateral issues, education, employment, basic living conditions, or basic sanitation conditions, which are the social determinants, as we have heard today, which affect health. I also think that something that we have been working on, and once again, the alliance has worked because we have been in touch with the states and representatives of the Riafro network and also with the IDB and Aladi. We have worked with PAHO, who have worked with us in this process. And there is an additional issue, which is related to the fact that we need to have a high level of alert in health, and that is the mental health issue. It is not mentioned often, but we do need to pay attention to this, and we need to start thinking about what has happened to the Afro-descendant population of the entire region after the pandemic, how they have been affected in the job market. What about the reintegration to the work market and education, from basic education to higher level education, how there is a racism and racial segregation due to the pandemic. We think that PAHO can continue providing a very valuable contribution for this, and we can do that through the public policies which we present in each one of our member countries. I am very pleased with the recently approved policy for the Afro-descendants in Peru. One of the difficulties that we have had to establish specific services or guidelines was precisely the fact that is related to access to information. So it is precisely very important to make this very visible in health, because all the problems that affect Afro-descendants in our regions end up being transversal, intersectional, and there is more tension regarding some issues than others, but it is very important that we should have all the issues because this cuts across all issues. Thank you so much, Susana, for your thoughts. We need to work across issues, especially within the United Nations work. The permanent forum for the Afro-descendant populations in the United Nations has been created, and I would like to present Pastor Murillo, who is a member of this forum, but he's also a friend whom I admire very much. I admire his work, and because of his fundamental role to have a decade, an international decade for Afro-descendants. Pastor Murillo, welcome. Thank you so much, Roberto. Our admiration is reciprocal. I would also like to thank OAS, PAJO, and Riafro for inviting me to participate in this panel. In your new role as a permanent member of the forum, what is your vision with regard to the promotion of the right to health for Afro-Descendants? A few minutes ago, we heard Oscar presenting the main lines of the recommendation regarding health determinants. That is a very important input for the agenda. Within the context of this commission and in other relevant bodies, I have summarized my thoughts with only one sentence. That is, and now it is much more obvious, as Susana said, due to the pandemic, how the world is smaller, every day smaller, and there is racism and inequality. And this has repercussions on health, on the living condition of peoples and persons. As the director of WHO, health does not start in clinics and hospitals. It starts at home. It depends on what we eat, how we live, where we live, the sanitary infrastructure that we have. So the social determinants of health that the WHO has noted that the final results in health depend on 30 to 50% on the social determinants of health. So the social determinants of health are valid, and the recommendation of PAHO are clearly reflected and clearly state this. And it was highlighted during the pandemic, ever more so. Nowadays, we can see that the possibility of avoiding future pandemics depends and is linked to the possibility of maintaining biodiversity in regions such as the Pacific and obviously the Amazons, which is our lung. These are the aspects which, in my view, should be at the center of our conversation. And the permanent forum on Afro-Descendants, which will officially inaugurated in December of this year in Geneva, Switzerland, without a doubt will have the right to health as one of the central issues within the framework of the possibility of a universal declaration of the right of Afro-Descendants. Thank you so much, Pastor. It is, in fact, very important to state that within the framework of the United Nations and also at the regional level, we will have a declaration on the rights of Afro-Descendants and also highlight the right to health, which will be fundamental to improve and strengthen the work of PAHO in the post-pandemic world. Precisely, in order to continue to talk about this, I will give the floor once again to my colleague Sandra Del Pino to go on to a second round of questions. Thank you so much, Roberto. I think that it is very important to put these initiatives in context, as some of our speakers were stating, within this post-pandemic context. We have also listened to important thoughts about the report of the Commission, which we have to take into account. So in order to start with recommendations which have already been approved, Oscar and Pastor reminded us, and Susana also was referring to determinants. I would like to Janaina to talk about how they who are now promoting the generation of analysis to see which are the inequalities. Janaina, which are the major obstacles that we face today to obtain these reports and analysis in today's post-pandemic context? Janaina.
I think my answer is in line with Adrian said before. I would definitely say that the main limitation is data availability, and quality. In our work, for instance, were able to include only 10 out of the 33 countries from Latin America and the Caribbean, as several surveys from countries in the region do not include questions to identify ethnic groups. Also, those with information often collect data using different questions, making comparisons difficult or presenting a higher percentage of missing information. And to overcome that, we need surveys that include ethnicity in their design, trying to ensure that the representativeness of different ethnic groups in the countries. Also, other sources of health data, such as administrative systems and medical records, should include a field for ethnicity to be informed, so the countries would be able to constantly monitor inequalities from different perspectives. And for that, we need the information to be seen as a priority. And I think another challenge is the ability to assess the independent and interactive effects of multiple factors that contribute to health-related racial and ethnic disparities, including socioeconomic position, geographic distribution, and culture. But despite the challenges, analyzing and reporting the observed differences, describing the intrinsic limitations, and suggesting ways to overcome them are crucial steps to stimulate the improvement of data collection processes. Also, much can be done with the information that is already available, and we need to do that more often to monitor inequalities and track progress. I think in summary, that's the challenge.
Muchísimas gracias, Janaina. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janaina. I would like now to return to Adrian to ask for some thoughts. We heard Susana speak about impacts on the issue of public policies, but I would like to ask Adrien, with regard to the analysis of the data and the generation of health intelligence, what, in your view, is the main reason why we should be promoting the availability of quality data which are disaggregated by ethnic quality?
Much of what I'm going to say, and I'm going to beat that drum even harder to say that we do need that high quality disaggregated data, and we need to really institutionalize collecting data on ethnicity at all levels, especially with our administrative data. It's very important. The issue Janaina tapped upon with looking at the intersectionality of multiple factors that have an impact on Afro-Descendant health, such as, all right, are we looking at, is there a Black female? What is her economic status? What is her educational status? What are other social determinants of health that really have an impact, putting this person at a disadvantage? So not just looking at one thing, but looking at how all those things together have an impact. And that way we can also look at policies within countries that have an impact on health that are not just in the health sector, but policies in other sectors that create this gap in health for Afro-descendants that we have. So improvement overall, not just in health sector administrative data, but in other data coming from national authorities. And as Janaina said, using these data. Countries do have information. Let's use what they already have to see where we are, but also to promote how this information can be put to use to help us, to guide us, to make better policies, to close gaps. This is very important. Oftentimes we want to collect, but sometimes we need to improve how we're collecting things. Sometimes we have surveys where we have Afro-descendants, but we don't have enough people sampled. What do we do then? We may need to oversample this group of people so that we can actually have data that is representative at a level, well, it will tell us something rather than having just a few cases. So we need to look into what have we already been doing? How do we improve that? And then what do we do new in the issue of improving data and the quality for disaggregated data, especially so we can continue to monitor and address the health of Afro-descendants in the region. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Adrien. Nos parece sumamente importante el continuar.
Thank you very much. I think that it is very important to continue generating this information. Thank you for your thoughts. Susana was mentioning some issues which I think are very important. What happened with COVID-19, what we have seen, and the inequalities which have become even more visible. We know that there are many challenges, and from what we have heard from our colleagues that are studying evidence, we know that there have been progresses. We know that this is the only regional office of WHO which managed to push a policy on 2017, and this was not sufficient. We wanted to see progress, and the groups in the region wanted to have more progress. So unanimously, we've pushed for a strategy and action plan for equity and health from 2019 to 2025. In the midst of all this, the pandemic arrived. So, Oscar, I would like to ask you, how are we driving these efforts in order to improve our strategy and action plan in a context such as our current post-pandemic context, which obviously slowed down the process a lot. But what progress are we making now? Oscar, please. Thank you so much. That is a difficult question. Let me start with something that you have mentioned, or better still, to insist on it. And I ask for forgiveness for the commercial. Our organization is the only organization in the United Nations system which has explicitly created goals for reduction of inequality in the strategic plan, which is the one that will direct the organization for a full 5-year plans. From 2014 to 2019, we already had an indicator for the impact level to reduce inequalities, so reduction of social inequalities in health. And now the first impact indicator is an indicator which is perhaps even more complex. It's not very difficult. The difficulty relies in obtaining the information to measure the reduction of inequalities within countries, which is the most important thing. We do not have to underline what we all know. We are the most unequal region, not only inequalities with regard to health, which is really way too unequal, but we also, there are inequalities with wealth and power. But in addition to that, we now have a regional policy of ethnicity and health, which specifically refers to the issue of ethnicity and health conditions and the well-being of the Afro-descendants. We also have a strategy and an action plan. This strategy and action plans has 5 strategic lines. The first one is to generate evidence. We there formulate very clearly the need to establish evidence. I think this is not just because we want to measure just for the sake of measuring, but this is a progress to document the differences in health. This is fundamental in order to inform the political powers the impact that policies have on social justice, and so that we may know which are the differences in equality in the health field. In addition to creating evidence, which is the first strategy, which is one of the 5 elements of the regional policy for equity and health. We need to create accountability, and this is something that should empower civil society to demand accountability, for instance, on the promise of no one left behind. This is in the Agenda 2030, which has a very explicit narrative and rhetoric that no one should be left behind, but there is no indicator of inequalities. So how can we be accountable and state that we are committed to do things to reduce ethnic and racial inequalities? For instance, in the death of mothers or minors, or in the incidence of tuberculosis, if we do not measure the inequalities. We're not just measuring them for measuring them. They should be measured, it should be reported, and there should be a report as recommended by the Commission to see what are the repercussions of these policies. I think that this is the way from the social aspect on which the organization has been working. And on this, I would like to say that we have the need to generate evidence, and then 4, which are more operational: development of capacity, recognition of traditional medicine, and drive policies for universal access, universal health services access. But this has all related. This plan has 3 impact indicators and 19 process indicators. I just wanted to reiterate, because I just said it, the 3 impact indicators of the strategy. The strategy is designed to measure the reduction in the inequality gap. That is the absolute difference that exists between the Afro-Descendant and the indigenous population as the population that does not self-identify as Afro-descendants and as indigenous population in mother mortality, infant mortality. And this should be measured in a wider framework. And this has to do with civil society, with other organizations, and with collaborating centers such as Pelotas. It should be showing the way. How can we prepare a framework or greater indicators which respond to the needs of each population? But essentially, these are the first. And in this sense, we are not only hoping for good quality data, disaggregated data, as Janaína has mentioned. It's not only Janaína, but her team has shown, not only this last document or in previous research papers, the importance to show the inequalities in the field of health. But we not only want to strengthen information systems by using good quality surveys, although they are expensive, but despite the oversampling which you mentioned, we should hope to document and monitor the intersectionality, the convergence, which is toxic, of vulnerabilities which are due to the vulnerabilities of social determinants. For instance, the inequality, and not only inequality, the denial of rights, dignity of an Afro person, a woman who is an Afro and is poor. In order to measure this, we need to have a very large sample.
And that's where surveys sometimes fail. We need to strengthen information systems so all countries have information systems and they invest in this, in the administrative system whose common denominator or a common identifier, even though they are in different ministries, are all they all have in common the territory. So it is called the eco-social approach. We measure inequalities in different health areas, as the ones I've mentioned, based on the relative social position of certain territories, certain municipalities, over 5,700 municipalities in Brazil, 1,100 in Colombia, etc., using an equity stratifier. It could be Afro-Descendant population vis-a-vis a reference population. There are different examples, and it is very useful to um, inform the policies. And this is something that concerns us every day without losing rigor. How can we make this into a proposal that is institutionalized in local health services and that it be scalable? Finally, I wanted to add two more things. I think we will have more time for a discussion. Regarding measurement, one of the challenges we have is how can we incorporate qualitative methodology to capture dimensions that are complex and very important in inequalities in Afro-descendant populations. And in this sense, I think that the proposal by the organization, and maybe Sandra could be talk more about this, are the knowledge dialogue. It is a methodology that has been published and there have been pilot projects on it, and they may be useful to monitor progress in reducing inequality gaps and in our aspiration that we have to improve living conditions and decent life for persons. And now, of course, we could reference COVID-19, but I think monkeypox has brought a crucial question, and it is how to protect vulnerable populations without creating contexts which then emphasize stereotypes, but without ignoring the important um, cultural situations. And it is not even a matter of putting in all the red tape paper that we have to fill out, not only to put a box to say whether you are Afro-descendant or if you are indigenous or whatever other stratifier by identity without creating stereotypes, because I think this is very important and we need to consider this and keep it in mind. So knowledge dialogues should help us in the effort that we are making to document and create intelligence, strategic information that allows us to make decisions according to the situation, engaging the situation. Over back to you, Sandra. Thank you, Oscar, for your reflections. Very thorough, not only regarding the policies and how to measure the country's advance in equity and health and to help visibilize the work being done in this region. Many of the presenters had said before there are many challenges, not only to generate evidence, but also after the pandemic and all these other emergent topics that you mentioned. I think, Roberto, that what we can say is that we do have a need to continue to encourage joint efforts and accelerate the work we are doing in order to truly be able to advance the health agenda for Afro-descendant populations. We are committed, but I'd like to say that it is very important to clarify that this is work that has to be that has to happen from the context of human rights. And so now, in that sense, over to you, Robert. Thank you, Sandra. And yes, Precisely. We need to continue to reinforce this collaboration. A sample of this collaboration was, for example, Riafro and Pajo work together within the framework of COVID-19. And I would like to uh, give the floor to Susana so that she can talk about Riafro's role in the access of Afro-descendant populations to vaccines during COVID-19. Yes, thank you, Roberto. I have been paying a lot of attention to the different colleagues who have spoken before me. And yes, in fact, there is something very important related to the pandemic, and it is that the network Riafro became activated and has been active for over 2 years of the pandemic of this crisis. Among the most important things has been to be able to communicate and be able to maintain people informed as to what was going on in each place. Statistical visibility, qualitative and quantitative matters related to the pandemic, political and economic and social matters related to health, which are part of the pandemic, have been concerns of ours, and we're constantly monitoring all of this, obtaining information, collecting it throughout the network, throughout Riafro. We have done webinars to talk about challenges, responses, installed capacities that we had to care for our populations. And it has been very important to focus on the statistical visibility. This has been a constant for the network, in addition to sharing information, studies. And this happened from the beginning. And Bajo has been a main uh, partner in during the pandemic. Yes, we have shared learnings as well as best practices. We've had a tough time, but there have been actions taken among the countries shared throughout the region. One of the most powerful and healthy things has been uh, the network's work declaring the importance of caring both at a cross-cutting and intersectional level, everyone across the board during the pandemic. But we also need a legal framework. We had a declaration exhorting the countries to make decisions, urging them to sign different international conventions against all kinds of discrimination. I think this is something we need to continue to encourage. This is an ongoing struggle. There is need for permanent, ongoing reflection, and we need to continue to encourage all of this because, yes, in fact, we make progress in some areas, but then we don't in others. So, as long as the conventions are not all signed, we will have weaknesses regarding our legal frameworks. Finally, I think that some of the important things that we have had in terms of Rianfro actions is related to studies that have been carried out working with different governments and states so that real information can be identified. This goes beyond including a variable of ethnic identification, etc. I have paid attention to what Oscar said, and I think we need to delve deeper into this topic. But yes, for example, administrative records and registries are important, but also the fact that the populations will demand their rights, efforts to articulate how to guarantee and promote Afro-Descendant populations so that they can vindicate and claim their rights so that they can receive the benefits of services that are according to the culture, their own culture. We need to generate levels of dialogue and articulation so that we can satisfy communal needs, and also that we continue to work on our goals for the decade, and that we need to take into account next steps. Yes, thank you very much, Susana. Yes, in order to learn about these international instruments and make visible the need to reinforce them and strengthen them, I'd like to ask Pastor, what are the international legal instruments which create standards of protection for Afro-descendant populations in the framework of health, and how are they reflected in the country's realities? Over to you, Pastor. Thank you, Roberto. The first thing we need to take into account is that the process of emergency of Afro descendants as subjects of international law is a recent theme, which got started by the Durban Conference, which ended in the proclamation of the International Year and the International Decade of Afro Descendants. In that sense, the legal frameworks that are that have been protecting the rights of Afro-descendant are classic instruments. The International Convention against all forms of discrimination and racial discrimination, and of course, the Inter-American Commission and other international agencies. And so these are used to demand the states to guarantee the rights of Afro descendants. However, this new architecture, this new institutional and legal structure which is emerging, is advancing in a positive way. And on the occasion of the International Year of Afro Descendants, the first tool adopted internationally was the General Recommendation number 34 on racism for eliminating racial discrimination, which includes the rights of Afro-descendants as subjects of international law. And this general recommendation incorporates or includes very specific provisions related to the right of health, right to health by Afro-descendant, right to social services, and the mandatoriness and commitment by states to take into account the dimension of Afro-descendants with their engagement when plans, programs, and policies are implemented in the field of health. General Recommendation number 34 says so explicitly, and this is very specific for Afro-descendants. And the PAHO has been incorporating this tool in international dialogues, and this tool should also be used because it is an instrument that fits perfectly with the mandate of the General Recommendation number 34. So, yes, we are constructing standards, but there are other broader matters, for example, or programs. For example, the program within the decade for Afro descendants, which there is the action plan for Afro descendants in the Americas, and this is something led by the OAS, and it tackles rights of Afro-descendants, including right to health, and also the rights of Afro-descendants. The right to health will place will be in an important place and a preeminent place. It will be the opportunity to tackle contemporary challenges entailed in groups that are historically discriminated against. And for example, matters of artificial intelligence, there is challenge in many areas, and health is always can be a matter of discrimination despite the use of tools and artificial intelligence. In the field of health, we see evidently that there are some impacts associated to historically discriminated groups as Afro-descendants. And the declaration I mentioned will reflect provisions and ways in which these matters can be tackled. Thank you. Thank you, Pastor.
As Susana mentioned, it is very important to use this international framework and also how we can help Afro-descendants to promote the use of their rights. In order to finalize this meeting, I would like to give the word to my colleague Sandra Del Pino so that she may ask a question that would lead us to the next steps in this agenda. Sandra, please, to wrap up. Thank you so much, Roberto. We could also do a quick round. We have 1 or 2 minutes per participant before we close the meeting. I would like to hear what is the message you would like to leave considering this meeting that we have had today to celebrate the International Day? What is the priority? Just one idea that would like to leave with our audience today and for the institutions that are present. And I would like to reiterate that we are sincerely committed to continue working with you. So, Roberto, if you will, we can start with Janaina.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Sandra and Oscar, for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to be here and learn from all these amazing partners. And I think it's a great point for us to think about what to do in this different context, this post-pandemic context that we are now. And it's been demonstrated that many direct and indirect effects of the pandemic were worse for Afro-descendants. And the indirect effects also exacerbate existing health inequalities. So I believe the main challenge will be to ensure the commitment of stakeholders and policymakers to a more comprehensive approach to the social determinants of health, instead of assuming that the pandemic consequences would be the same for all. Also, the health sector is not the only one responsible for addressing the causes and the roots of health inequalities. That means that we would have to target improvements in the overall living conditions, including focused actions against ethnic discrimination and structural racism in collaboration with several other sectors. And for all of that, we need also commitment to proper data collection and analysis so that we would implement evidence-based, equity-oriented health policy. And we also need to ensure that Afro-descendants be part of the decision-making processes. I think it's very important. So I work with data analysis, but I also believe that more than data analysis, we need to recognize the successful initiatives that have been helping to close the gaps. And for that, we need to keep monitoring and discussing more than the results, the numbers, but the entire context. And we need to do that with the participation of Afro-descendants in the whole process. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janaina. Adrian, would you like to leave us a message?
Thank you, Sandra. The greatest message I would like to leave is let's actively use the information that we have. I think most times we say, oh, there's not enough data, we don't have this, we don't have that. We do have information. So let's not continue to ignore at least what we have and make the commitment to do better where we can improve on the question of data as it relates to Afro-descendants and disadvantaged groups. Because if we don't count them, they will continue to be invisible. And we won't pinpoint any of the issues. I think this is really something we have even in Pajo. When we look at the Latin American and Caribbean region, we tend to leave out countries of greater wealth, such as the United States or Canada. But if you go down to the level of population and Afro-descendants, as well as indigenous people, you'll see that there is a whole nother Canada, there's a whole nother America that you see that is totally different. So to make the mistake in saying, well, this country is far developed, they handled this well, maybe they're not handling that well. And if you don't count them and you don't bring up these issues, these people are invisible in the regional context. So I am making the point to let's use what we have, let's improve what we have, and let's use that to improve policies and turn that into evidence and act on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Oscar?
Gracias, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Janaína's and Adrian's comments are very interesting, and I'm sure that Susana and Pastor are also going to make interest observations. From my own little cubbyhole, I will support what Janaína has said and what Adrian has said. A lesson that must be learned. We say, oh, we have learned the lesson, as if we learned lessons automatically due to lapse of time, but that is not the fact. One lesson that we need to learn after COVID is that we cannot continue to be blind in front of inequity. We have the issue of epidemiological surveillance. There is no data disaggregation. How can we provide differentiated responses if we do not have the information? Suffering has been terrible with COVID. So for me, the main message, the message that we have from the trenches of the workers is to continue monitoring, do not turn a blind eye to inequity, and continue looking at the changes. And coming out of the trenches now, it is unavoidable looking at the pandemic scenery, which is not over yet. And this has to do with what Susana mentioned. I will say it more modestly, but Susana said it very clearly. I believe that it is very important to strengthen a movement or to foster a change in the region by indicating which are the rights. And that is fundamental in order to create social capital. Essentially, for me as an epidemiologist, that is the issue. This last pandemic has proved that there is a lack of social capital, social responsibility, civil responsibility, credibility in the institutions. As a human community, we have a deficit on things that are based on reciprocity rules, which create confidence in the institutions and a general concern on the well-being of others. I believe that that is the greatest tragedy that COVID has brought forth. And in order to make progress to equity, we need to construct social capital. Thank you. Thank you so much, Oscar. Susana, please go ahead. A message for today. I would like to avail myself of this minute to be grateful, because every time we have the opportunity to discuss these issues that we have at heart, we learn something new. And I believe that this August 31st, when we will have to have the responsibility to meet to celebrate progress made with regard to Afro-descendants, will also give us the opportunity to make progress with these thoughts. And the issue of health, which is very sensitive, we have had the least access to health throughout history. Slavery, migrations have been situations whereby have been crucial for the situation that we have at present. So we need to have the obligation to reflect on how much progress has been made. I agree with Pastor that Durban has changed the history, but has also changed our position and the position of the human race. So we need to meet again, if we do, the next August 31st, to see how much progress we have been able to make with regard to the issues that Janaína, Adrián, Oscar, Pastor, and see how much progress has been accomplished. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Susana. Excellent comments. We make a note of it, and we hope that next year we will see the progress that has been made. Pastor, a message for today. Thank you so much, Sandra. Yes, I would like to join the thanks that have been given for this meeting. I would like to join what Oscar has said with regard to the need to build social capital. But I would also like to insist on the fact that this mobilization that was presented when there was a public execution, which was followed by, this was preceded by a concrete fact, and that is the visibility that the repercussions of the pandemic had on Afro-descendants in the United States. And then we saw that this was not only happening in the United States, but it was also happening in Europe and in Brazil. So what I would like to point out is that this social sensibility, this collective global action, the global conscience came forth after the assassination of George Floyd, but this started, and it was obvious due to the data that we saw when we saw what were the repercussions of the pandemic, and how this, for the first time, the world realized that what was affecting Afro-descendants is something that affected us all. They felt it then, and they expressed it when George Floyd was assassinated. So I think that this is something important to point out. That is an element where we then saw that in the case of Brazil, statistics are clear because they do have statistics. They have the Afro-descendant variable in the records of COVID, and we know that the Afro-descendant population was affected in a disproportionate ratio. That pregnant women who died were mostly Afro-descendant women, and we knew that because the statistics reflected this. In Colombia, the ethnic variable was also included in COVID-related data. So without a doubt, it is important to continue providing details about the ethnic and racial population in the national systems of health. This is an important task. And finally, I would like to reiterate that there is an interdependence which is at the center of the challenges we meet. Thank you so much. Thank you much, Pastor. Thank you so much to all members of the panel. It was a true pleasure to be with you today, learning from all of you. We hope to continue working with OAS, with the Riafro network, and continue learning from you and continue working for an agenda in health that should be within a framework of human rights. Roberto, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the possibility to have listened to the speakers. I also thank the opportunity to continue reinforcing this cooperation with PAHO in order to provide access to health to the Afro-Descendants. And I am certain that throughout the coming months and years, we shall reinforce the cooperation, especially because it has an importance of intercultural policy, and we will be reinforcing this cooperation.
One of the reflections, and which was also sent in one of the Facebook comments, is never forget the diversity and intersectionality of the Afro-Descendant population and in other agendas. For example, the elderly, people with disabilities. There's also the Afro-Descendant variable, and we need to emphasize diversity. In gender, some progress has been made, but if we go deeper, we need to see what is the situation of indigenous Afro-Descendant women and what to do about that. This is a first step. This is a collaboration for several years, and the idea is to continue to reinforce it for the benefit of millions of people. I'm going to give the floor to Susana so that she, as representative of the unit, will formally close this webinar. Thank you, Roberto. Thank you all for being here, for having listened to us. Please continue to work in the activities of the Riafro networks. Much work needs to be done to improve the conditions of Afro-descendants in the Americas. Thank you very much for the invitation, Roberto, and all the team from the OAS and Bajo, Sandra, Oscar Adrian, and the others who are here, and Janine Pastor for being here and sharing their knowledge. See you next time. Thank you very much. And please.
Recording stopped.
We have stopped the recording, and we could